Okay, turns out I lied. This cuts you off at 15 minutes, so I'm breaking this video up. Hopefully this one will come in more like 7 or 8 minutes, and then I'll do probably two to cover the Paula Treichler. You guys are staying busy. Um, okay, so I think I was here at the end talking about um, uh, Judith Federle. Um, and The Resisting Reader. And I think I said that is another text I'd like you to remember the name of, even though I think it will be listed under the feminist section instead of here in the reader response section. But two names slash text to remember, um, Stanley Fish and Judith Federle. Okay, let's see. When I moved from there, I moved over here to um, 8. I was coming back over here to 8. And I wanted to just mention this reception theory. That's essentially a school of criticism that looks at, it historicizes. So it does what you may remember in one of those Richter articles we read about Jane Tompkins looking at the history of the reception or the ways that certain time periods interpreted Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. That's reception theory. The idea that um, over time, um, texts are viewed differently by different, um, groups of people. So that's an interesting idea, reception theory. That's all I really need to say. Coming back over here to 9, we sort of come back to this issue um, of the identity theme and subjective ways of reading. Federle brings up, and so does Nancy K. Miller, this issue of, are there essential differences between the way women and men read and write? In other words, is there a female way of reading? And then he comes down here to Wayne Kestenbaum, who asks, is there a homosexual way of reading? This just prefigures what we'll talk about a lot in the feminist and particularly gender criticism uh, lectures, which is the issue of essentialism. Are things like one's uh, sex or sexual orientation essential, inbred, i.e., nature, or are they nurture? Essentially, are they constructed by the culture? So I just wanted to point that out and kind of prefigure where we're headed next. The last thing in this first lecture that I want to point to, number 10. Let's see. I've got at the here on 346. He's talking about someone named Rabinowitz, whom I don't know. Um, Showing how a society's ideological assumptions about gender, race, and class determine the way in which artistic um, works are perceived or evaluated. That is a type of reception theory, and we get that next. In other words, are we likely to see texts in a more feminist way when we're in a more feminist period of our culture or our history? I will skip this sort of uh, précis or abstract about the Paula Treichler essay and look instead right now briefly at his works cited or his bibliography. Um, Again, here is a name to remember for the test: Stanley Fish. You don't have to remember Eugene. Two texts I'd like you to remember that he wrote. One is there a text in this class? I referenced that, I think, in class the day we did Dr. Coleman's essay. Um, and then this one I just find really interesting: Surprised by Sin, the Reader in Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, of course, is Milton's poem about Satan being cast out of heaven and then essentially going to war with God over who would have dominion. Um, and what Fish is talking about in Surprised by Sin is the idea that as readers, we find ourselves, particularly after book 1 of the big poem Paradise Lost, identifying with Satan. He is an extremely compelling character, and we realize towards the end of the chapter, dude, I am rooting for Satan over God. That seems like a problem. And yet we do it anyway. So that's surprised by sin as a way that as readers um, we get um, we get tricked, I guess. I don't know. All right, let's see. I am going to do two other things here, and then I'll stop and start a new lecture on the Paula Treichler um, essay. First thing I'm going to do is go to the very back of the book, page 418. Um, this is the acknowledgments page, and it tells you where this book, I'm sorry, this essay that we're about to read, called The Construction of Ambiguity in the Awakening, a Linguistic Analysis by Paula A. Treichler, where it comes from. This one comes from a book. The book is entitled Women in Language and Literature and Society. It has 3 editors, these 3 people, and it was published in 1980. I point that out for 2 reasons. One, because you always want to be aware of the date of the text you're reading. And you always want to acknowledge that when you bring a text up in your paper. When did it happen? How does it relate in time to others? So essentially, let's consider this Paula Treichler a 1980 essay. I would actually assume it's earlier than that, but I think it's worth doing. Okay, I'm going to also then go to the very end of this essay, which is the work cited, and talk about sources a little bit here, and then we'll stop. So I just told you, when you find an article, a critical article about a literary text, it's going to come from one of 2 places most of the time. One is it can be a chapter or an essay printed in a larger book, like this Treichler essay was. And 2, it can be printed in an academic journal, something along the lines of American Literature Quarterly or the Hemingway Review. A journal that you submit your paper to, a group of scholars read it, and then they give thumbs up or thumbs down, and so you get published. Both of those are what we call peer-reviewed manners of getting published. I've got 5 publications in my career. 2 of them are in books. They are chapters in books. 3 of them are in journals. But it is worth being aware of where they come from. Okay, now, the types of sources you will use. When I look at this Treichler essay, I'm frankly looking at it less to try and teach you more about reader response than I am to try and teach you how to write a literary researched analysis paper. And what you do is you add 2 things, essentially, to your close reading. So you did the close reading of your short story, or in Paige's case, your novel, at the beginning, last two or 3 weeks ago. Your research paper will take some version of that argument about that text, and it will add 2 things. One I call they say. So you can see that I've written they say here. They say means you are looking at what other critics have said about that text. And so you are positioning your argument in the broader conversation about that text. Some texts that you guys have done have a ton of things written about it. Grace, you are doing Hills Like White Elephants. Tons of essays on Hills Like White Elephants. Anna Blake, Yellow Wallpaper. Anna Grace, Rose for Emily. A lot of stuff on those. Others, there's less on. I don't know, Garrett, about Lovecraft and Dagon. I would assume fewer articles than some of these others. And of course, Paige, you're doing a novel, a really cool novel, by the way, class, called My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa, I always get her name wrong, Moshfegh, I think. But it's published in 2019. So the only criticism that's out there are book reviews. So that's your they say. What are people saying in reviews about this text, and how do you position your argument about it in relation to that? Okay, the second thing that you are adding to your argument to make this a paper is what I call framework. That's what this little word is here, although I think it's very hard to read. Framework. What that framework sources are not about your text. They lay out the intellectual or cultural or historical or theoretical framework or lens through which you're viewing this text. All right. Some of you will view your text through a biographical lens. I can't off the top of my head go through and think of what everybody might do, but we've already talked about that with a lot of you about how your original idea didn't work as much for the close reading as it might for this next bigger paper. What I'm going to do with every one of these 4 essays that we read over the next 2 weeks is go to the Works Cited and essentially point out what they are. This is a they say essay or source because it says the treatment of Chopin's The Awakening. Patricia Allen wrote an essay clearly about The Awakening. Notice this is in a book. Old Critics and New is in a book called The Authority of Experience, Essays in Feminist Criticism, edited by Diamond and Edwards from 1977. Cully, they say, it mentions Edna Pontellier. It's about The Awakening. Seierstedt, sort of they say and sort of framework because Per Seierstedt wrote biographies, and a biography of her may talk directly and interpretively about the awakening, which it does, but also may give you a sort of biographical framework for understanding the awakening. So that one's sort of in the middle. Spax, The Female Imagination, that's a feminist text, I would say. That said, Treichler quotes it on page 362 in terms of a claim that it makes about the awakening. All right. Sullivan and Smith, this one's in a literary journal called Studies in American Fiction from 1973, clearly a they say. Wheeler, from the Southern Review of 1975, another they say, The Five Awakenings of Edna Pontellier, and Cynthia Griffin Wolfe, Thanatos and Eros in Kate Chopin's The Awakening, obviously a they say, American Quarterly 25. Some of the essays we'll read will do a lot more with framework. This one does a lot more with they say. Tune in soon for another probably set of 2 lectures that in which I walk through this essay by Paula Treichler called The Construction of Ambiguity in the Awakening, a Linguistic Analysis. Meanwhile, go get some coffee, have a good time, take it easy. Bye.